Hello, my name is Hallie Romine, and today I'm going to be presenting on the Cambodian genocide. So just quickly, what we're going to go over today, we're going to do a brief introduction of the Cambodian genocide and a general overview. We're going to learn about the Khmer Rouge, which was the Communist Party of Cambodia at the time during this genocide. We're going to learn about Pol Pot, who was the leader behind the Khmer Rouge. We're going to learn about the reign of the Khmer Rouge and the effects that they had on Cambodia during that reign. We're going to discuss how the Khmer Rouge regime ended up toppling and the massacres were put to an end, and then just a couple of concluding thoughts and statements. So an overview of the Cambodian genocide, it was the systematic persecution and murder of Cambodian citizens. And there was a massive amount of different targets, which we'll get into. This occurred from 1975 to 1979 and took place by the Khmer Rouge, which was led by Pol Pot, who was also known as Brother Number One. This resulted in the deaths of 1.5 to 2 million people, which equates to about 25% of their population at the time. And the people that they did target for those murders is previous governmental leaders, journalists, students, doctors, lawyers, intellectuals, and just anybody that wasn't deemed pure, but more specifically, anybody who could potentially rise up against what the Khmer Rouge was doing at the time. So let's get into the specifics of what the Khmer Rouge is. So it is the Communist Party of Cambodia. They were built up in the eastern jungles of Cambodia, and it wasn't until they were able to overthrow the government that they ever had really any stake in the country. During their regime, they were autocratic, totalitarian, repressive, and focused massively on national purity. So generally just a very repressive regime. They're known for their summary executions, torture, and medical experiments on Cambodians. And the Khmer Rouge also sought out to lead an agricultural reform, enforcing a collectivization, which led to famine and death by disease. So that's kind of a brief overview of what the Khmer Rouge is, and we'll get into more specifics with their reign in just a minute. So let's talk about Pol Pot, who led this awful group, and that would be Pol Pot. So during his early days, he was educated in very elite schools. So he's a very educated man. He did some of his schooling in Paris, and this is where he joined the French Communist Party. When he returned back to Cambodia, I believe he was a professor or a teacher and was very heavily invested and involved in the Marxist-Leninist movement at the time. In regards to the communist revolution, he was a revolutionary. He was the leading member of the Khmer Rouge. He led the coup that overtook the Cambodian government, and he was the dictator who ruled Cambodia from 1976 to 1979. And kind of a little bit about his time as dictator. He had transformed their government into a single party. There was no opposing parties outside of the Khmer Rouge. He forced a agrarian society, which he believed would lead to a communist society, and was the best way to establish that. This also led to the idea of a relocation program, so taking people out of the cities and moving them to more rural areas so that they could become agriculturalists, and then essentially just cutting off Cambodia entirely from the outside world so that they had full and complete control over the individuals there. So let's kind of put some of these different events together into a timeline. In 1975, this is when the Khmer Rouge seized power and began fulfilling its goals. So post 1975, they were just building up in those eastern jungles. Once the government was destabilized enough, the Khmer Rouge came in, seized power, and that's when they started to work towards the agrarian society, which would lead to the communist society, national purity, and all of their largely negative goals. In 1976, Cambodia was renamed to the Democratic Cambodia, which really just solidifies that Khmer Rouge was in charge and they were the ones who were in power. 2 years after the name changed, the Vietnamese military invaded and ended the regime due to Cambodia starting to encroach on their area, and the amount of refugees that were flowing into Vietnam led to the Vietnamese invading and ultimately ending the regime. And then by 1979, that was when it finally was put to an end. There were no more active Khmer Rouge individuals that were essentially leading these small agrarian communities. And by this time, 1.5 to 2 million people were dead, largely due to the policies that were enforced by the Khmer Rouge. So let's kind of talk about their reign. Now that we know who the Khmer Rouge are, who Pol Pot is, let's talk about what that reign looked like for the Cambodians. One of the biggest things was isolation. They did isolate Cambodia from outside sources and outside foreign influences, which has led to difficulty reestablishing those ties today. But yeah, they were largely isolated. They stopped trade with foreign influences and communication. Everything foreign was ended. Schools, hospitals, and factories, many of them, almost all of them, closed and were utilized in other ways. For example, the S-21 prison, which is one of the most famous prisons during this time frame, was initially a high school. So a lot of these buildings, the actual day-to-day operations were ended and they utilized that building for something else. They also abolished banking, finance, and currency. They just got rid of all of it. They wanted people to trade and barter with food, not money. And Pol Pot believed that this would lead to the perfect communist society. Speaking of communism, a collectivist society was put to work. So essentially what the Khmer Rouge did is they evacuated people from the cities and put them in more rural areas so that they could start agricultural societies, which were very similar to pre-war rural societies in Cambodia. Pol Pot really admired those rural communities and thought that that was the way to go. So he forced everybody else to also do this. Next, they did abolish education, not fully, but quite a bit, and it did decrease literacy rates, writing rates, and those things are still decreased to this day. And anybody within the education sector was murdered during these genocides because they were a potential threat to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. So education was also out the window. And possibly the most well-known part of the reign of the Khmer Rouge is the many, many crimes against humanity that they did. They arrested, tortured, and executed enemies. They utilized brutal prison systems, starvation, experimentation, and so many other things that were just horrible, horrible crimes against humanity. So this was a very, very depressing time for Cambodia. And that's kind of a brief overview of what their reign looked like. So kind of how the Khmer Rouge regime comes to an end is war with Vietnam. Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge started a preemptive invasion on Vietnam, which led to massive border conflict. So Vietnam fought back. And that is when they captured Phnom Penh, which was the capital at the time. So they did capture this area and started to push the Khmer Rouge back more west. This led to defeat and retreat. So Vietnam came in and established a moderate communist government, and the Khmer Rouge were immediately kicked out. They did sit in conflict a little bit with the government during these guerrilla action warfares. However, it wasn't enough for anybody to be necessarily concerned about. There were trials for all of the individuals involved in the Khmer Rouge genocide, though those are thought to be largely for show than to bring people to justice. And then, of course, there are many lasting impacts of this time frame that still occur today, which we'll talk about just a little bit. They did transition back to a functionary democracy in 1993. The government is still difficult to work with. However, no one wants to experience another genocide again, so nobody is willing to stand up to that democracy. Religion, Buddhism was massively picked at during the Khmer Rouge regime, but it has recovered and fully returned. Most individuals in Cambodia identify with Buddhism. Tourism has become something quite not massive, but growing. Locations connected to the genocide are massive tourist spots as people are interested in learning more about that. The economy is still very difficult and not very well. They are rebuilding it. However, when you lose as much as you did and you lose as many people as you did, that makes it more difficult to rebuild. Essentially, the genocide pushed Cambodia backwards, and now they're trying to slowly work their way back forwards. And then this last one was a little bit more prevalent directly after the genocide. However, it still applies today. Most of the people who have the skills to rebuild Cambodia were murdered or they fled. So they didn't have the skill set to rebuild Cambodia, which is still has lasting impacts on Cambodia today. So many impacts. So just some brief conclusionary thoughts. The genocide did much more than just take lives. It destroyed a country and forced it to rebuild from almost nothing, a task that is still underway to this day. There's a lot of reasons that the genocide occurred. One of the biggest ones that scholars believe is when the United States bombed Cambodia during the Vietnam War. This destabilized their government, which allowed for the Khmer Rouge to come in, essentially allowing for the massacre to happen. And it wouldn't be necessarily fair to say, oh, the United States is the reason that this genocide happened. It's not necessarily correct. It is a domino effect from something the United States did. But I think what frustrates me the most is the United States knew that they were a part of this, even though it was indirectly. and yet they've done nothing to help this country rebuild. Surrounding countries have done nothing to help this country rebuild, and that's the biggest issue, is at what point do we decide that helping others to help themselves is fine, but we can just help one another and create a world in which everybody can live happily, equally, and with enough money to make it day to day. So, yeah, I think that's everything. And that is my presentation.